hope you can all hear me okay. I'm Addison, I'm one of the consultants here at Inclusive Employers, and I'm going to be guiding you through this webinar on day 4 of National Inclusion Week. And what we're going to be looking at today is how to empower inclusion through inclusive meetings. Before I introduce our guests for today's webinar, I'd like to start by saying a huge thank you to all of you. Inclusive Employers set up National Inclusion Week 7 years ago, and each year, thanks to the energy, commitment and determination of so many of our member organisations, the week has gone from strength to strength. So thank you to everyone who's been involved. 2019 has been the biggest and best so far, and that's certainly thanks to all the team here at Inclusive Employers, and also, of course, our headline sponsor for 2019, who have been key in making all of this happen, McDonald's UK and Ireland. Thank you, McDonald's. We'd like to particularly thank Nita Zakaria and the Women's Leadership Development Group at McDonald's for their amazing ideas, dedication and passion to make everyday inclusion a reality. If you'd like to check out more, please go on Twitter and look at #EverydayInclusion and McDonald's #Hello. We're going to be posting more National Inclusion Week updates there, and you can follow what we've been up to. So without further ado, let's get started. So today's session is about empowering inclusion through inclusive meetings. I'm joined today by Jackie and Paul from the Bank of England. Jackie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi Edison. I'm Jackie Eaton. I've been at the bank for 7 years now. I was head of learning and development, and I'm now a strategic HR business partner working for our markets and banking directorate. So I look after all elements of people process and people strategy for about 600 people.
Okay, I'm also joined by Paul. Do you want to introduce yourself, Paul?
Hi, I'm Paul Wright. And by the way, that noise in the background is not me trying to escape the room. There's a little bit of noise in the background, so bear with us. So I head up the inclusion and sustainability team at the Bank of England. It's quite a new role. I've only been doing it 3 months, but I've been involved in diversity and inclusion for some years. So I hope you enjoy what Jack and I have got to share. And so I'll hand back to Addison, I think.
Yep, so thanks for that, and apologies again, we've got some drilling going on behind us, but hopefully you can hear us. So what we'll be covering today is how to empower inclusion through inclusive meetings. And the reason we've got Paul and Jackie with us is because this is something they've been working on recently, and they're going to share some of their experiences with us. So what we're going to be covering is the challenge of inclusion in meetings, the fact that inclusive meetings give us an opportunity to think a bit differently about how we do what we do, look at some techniques for inclusive meetings, and then there'll be some time at the end for Q&A. A bit of housekeeping. If you have questions, please type them in the chat box for us as they sort of pop up to you, and we'll get to those at the end. If you're having any technical issues, please make sure you read through your joining instructions in the email, because there's some kind of standard troubleshooting tips in there. Or please read Zainab's message in the chat box, and she can help you out if anything is not working for you. Okay, so I think we've all been in this situation before. We're sitting through a meeting that's dull, that isn't relevant, or where only 1 or 2 people contribute. Ideally, every meeting should be worth the time given over to it, and should be a space where everyone can contribute and benefit from that diversity of thought. Inclusive Employers have inclusive meetings. Jackie, I know that the Bank of England have been trying to make your meetings more inclusive and worthwhile to all your staff. Do you want to tell us about some of the challenges that you faced?
Yeah, I can. So we attend a lot of meetings in our life at the bank, and we've focused actually in the last couple of years in making our meetings more effective generally. But a key element of that is how we can be more inclusive in meetings. And yeah, very good business reasons for that in terms of diversity of thought. The more we can get everybody in the room to contribute, there'll be different ways of thinking, different backgrounds, different experiences, and all of that will help us in making the right judgments. But also it's just the right thing to do. It feels good when you can engage everybody. It feels good to know that you're bringing everybody can be brought into the conversation or feels able, and it feels like a safe environment to speak up. So some of the challenges we've identified, well, there's 4 really that we've identified, but the dynamics of those can interact with each other as well. So we noticed that it could be that the most senior person or the most technical person speaks up the most, or is looked to speak up, or is looked to be the first person to speak. So that very, very clearly happens in some of our meetings. Secondly, we've noticed that preferences around introversion and extroversion can mean that extroverted colleagues may be more likely to do the talking or fill the gap if there are spaces. Introverted colleagues might be more likely to be thinking, to be formulating what they want to say in their heads, and sometimes have difficulty in having room to speak up. Thirdly, virtual meetings are fun. Virtual meetings, particularly if it's by telephone, where you can't actually see the individual. We've found that video conferencing actually really helps, because it gives you more of an idea that somebody does want to come in to speak up, to say something. But by telephone, we do quite a few cool telephone conferences, and you can forget the person on the phone, and I've done that. You can forget to bring them into the conversation.
It's your short-term memory issues, isn't it,
my
Jack?
Short-term, absolutely, my age. And then fourthly, it's been quite interesting reading research on men tend to speak over women in meetings.
So I don't know what you're talking about, Jackie.
Thank you, Paul. That's very apt. Research suggests that men do tend to speak over women in meetings. Now, I wasn't sure about this, and I thought, well, this can't possibly happen. I'm a professional. I've been at work a long time. I'm very confident. But actually, I just observed some meetings, and yeah, men, there is a tendency, not in every meeting, but there can be a tendency for men to talk over women. I don't think it's on purpose. I just think it happens. And again, these are all things where a person can dominate the conversation, or 1 or 2 people can dominate. And it's about what we do about those to try and make the meeting more inclusive.
There's a good point there as well. I think if you think about other workplaces where often you're going to have a few of those things happening at once. So it could be that in your organisation, the most senior or technical people in the room are also men. So then you've got that kind of double whammy of them being the ones who are more likely to lead the conversation or steer it a certain way, or even speak over people, and people aren't being listened to. And then similarly, if you think about something like you might have people remote working who might be parents or carers or have other things going on, so then that's almost like a bit of a barrier for them being fully included in that meeting. And then you've got the layer of introversion and extroversion over the top. So I can see situations where all these 4 factors, these challenges you've noticed, are interacting with one another.
Yeah. I've been on the end of it. I mean, I'm quite extroverted in nature. I'm quite happy to speak up, fill the room, talk over people. Don't do it to upset them, but I get excited about what's being talked about, and I like to join in the conversation. But I've been on the end of a phone on a telephone conference and found it really difficult to know when I can speak and when is it okay, and am I interrupting somebody's train of thought if I speak up. So yeah, virtual meetings are particularly challenging.
And it's like I say, it's just remember to bring those people back into the conversation. I mean, I think it'd be great if a telephone just bleeped or had a flashing light on top of it, so you remember they're there. Because I mean, I've done it before, walked out of a meeting and completely forgotten that someone was left on the end of the phone. So it's just remembering to just think about everybody who's in the meeting, whether they're there in the room or not.
So that's some of the challenges that the Bank of England have noticed, and I'm sure those of you listening will have seen these sort of things playing out in your meetings too. So this picture is maybe a bit more what we'd want a meeting to look like, rather than just one person holding court and everyone else falling asleep at the back. Setting out to make your meetings more inclusive is an opportunity to think a bit differently about what you actually want to get out of your meetings, and even why you have them in the first place. I think meetings can be one of those parts of the workplace where we tend to do what we've always done, or do what we've experienced in other workplaces, and not actually sort of consciously think about how we might want to do it differently, or what we actually want to get out of being there. And I think added on top of that is if you've got a diary that's full of meetings back to back, you don't actually probably have a lot of time to even think about how you want those meetings to be. You're always playing catch up. If we think about some of the meetings that we've sat through that we found frustrating or not felt able to contribute, there might be various factors involved in that. So I can think of meetings where it's always the same people talking or leading it, where everyone sort of looks to the most senior person almost to take charge or to chair it. And where really what's happening there is nobody is empowered to actually get involved or to share what they think. And it can become quite a sort of dull and flat experience for everybody. I think meetings can also be a space where people revert to type. So the extroverts speak up, the introverts stay quiet. Your hierarchy gets in the way of that genuine discussion and decision making. And then the risk you've got there is that groupthink starts to take over. And really, you're not actually probably achieving what you want to out of having that meeting. Like I said, we often run meetings how they've been run before. So as a result, we run the risk of repeating the same mistakes. So with that in mind, and kind of the point of today's session, that's where making a change is important. An inclusive meeting is one where everyone feels empowered to contribute and to be their best selves. And there are ways that you can set up your meetings so that they're much more inclusive of everybody. In an inclusive meeting, everyone gets a chance to contribute and all voices have equal weight. The facilitator helps people prepare by sharing the agenda in advance and takes care to minimise interruptions during the meeting, resulting in a better outcome. So that's the sort of idea of how you can think a bit differently about your meetings going forward, about how you don't have to do them the same way you've always done them, and what that actually gives you is an opportunity to do things a bit differently. So we're going to get into the meat of it now in terms of the actual techniques for having inclusive meetings. So Paul and Jackie, we've talked about these challenges around kind of seniority, a hierarchy, introversion and extroversion, the challenge of sort of technology and virtual meetings, especially by phone, and then the research of men speaking over women. And also you could probably expand that out to how sort of hierarchies and dominance around certain areas will play themselves out in those spaces. Let's have a talk about some of the techniques you've tried and the impact that they've had, starting with Paul.
So I think preparation is key. The more you invest up front, the more you're going to get out of the meeting. So just think carefully about the agenda, what you want to actually get out of the meeting. And when you go into the meeting, make sure you're clear about your intentions. And somebody said it to me the other day. When you think about it, it doesn't take any more time to do a meeting in an inclusive way than it does to do it in any other way. So just think about what you're doing. I mean, I summed up to a few friends some time ago saying, I was at a meeting one time and all of a sudden I realized that there were the extroverts and introverts. All of a sudden I felt like a conductor of an orchestra. So I was trying to the violin section were maybe getting a little bit rowdy, so I tried to bring them down a little bit and try and bring the percussion up a little bit. And so it is a little bit of bringing that into mind, but also making sure that you layer that with watching out for body language. Jackie touched on the point that people who are more introverted will sometimes need to think more about what they want to say and how they want to contribute. So one way I've found to bring those individuals into the conversation is to just let people know that you'll be coming to them for their comment and their contribution to the meeting. And then my final thing before I hand over to Jackie to do a few more points is we have so many meetings in the bank, Jackie's mentioned it, and getting from one meeting to another does mean that sometimes meetings don't start on time. Now, I'm a bit of a time merchant. So I'm now in the space of, if there are enough people in the room to get the conversation going, I will start that meeting, because I'm in the space of, I want to respect those that have turned up on time to a meeting rather than, I'll say it as I see it, pander to those that haven't maybe turned up on time, and sometimes for very good reasons. So on that thought, I'll just hand over to Jackie for some of her observations.
Yeah, so I think in the planning space, definitely putting agendas together is something we've done a lot of work on. Giving some thought to really what goes into that agenda and sending it out in advance So it can be easy to get in the habit of sending the agenda the day before, the night before, almost just confirming it in the room at the meeting. What we found is sending it in advance, and in advance I mean 2 to 5 working days before. And actually, colleagues who work part-time have said that 5 days in advance really helps them because of their working patterns. They've sometimes found if they only work 2 days a week, that they're literally preparing for a meeting because of their working pattern in the meeting. So sending agendas out in advance, and then to build on that, really, what we've been able to do is then check whether the agenda is right for people, but whether there are particular points they would like to raise in the meeting. So again, thinking as an extrovert, I always try to think, well, you know, introversion is different to my preference. How could I ensure that I'm doing enough to bring introvert colleagues into conversations in meetings? And just asking if anyone would like to particularly raise any comments or particularly wants to speak about a particular agenda point, just helps to, again, conduct the meeting in a way that's more inclusive than it has been before. And that's worked really well.
So historically, I was dying to butt in there because there was thought went through my head about prepping for meetings, and this is a really key point because Jackie was talking about people with different working patterns, and that's if you have a regular meeting, don't always have it on the same day or at the same time, because that in itself could be exclusive in terms of people who I say don't work Mondays or don't work Thursdays. So think about when you're holding your meetings as much as anything else.
Yeah, people have different energy levels at different times of day, so there isn't an ideal time for everybody. We're all different, but again, if you do in the morning one week, in the afternoon another, hopefully we're getting the best out of everybody in the long run. So yeah, preparation is key. I think we all agreed on that one. And then what can we do during meetings? Well, yeah, there is a lot to be said about processes of planning for things. But it's just as important that we really pick up on interpersonal skills in meetings. It's not just a case of following point by point what's on the agenda. And this builds on what Paul was saying about body language, really. So chairs can have a really important role in this, in actively listening, observing what's going on, looking out for verbal and non-verbal cues, which is sometimes easier when it's not a telephone conference. You can literally see, keep an eye on the body language that's going on in the room. You can often pick up by somebody's body language if they slightly lean forward, if they sort of go to open their mouth and then close it. You can just check whether there is something that they wanted to be brought in on. It's more difficult to do with virtual meetings where somebody's on the phone. You can use messenger systems on your computers, on your laptops that are in the room. Somebody can put a message up to say they'd like to speak. But it's even better if you just ask if the person on the phone wanted to speak at that point, or give them a 2-minute warning that you'll be coming to them to see if they've got anything to add into the meeting as well. But we found really trying to focus on listening and observing and building time into the agenda for doing that, for really having a conversation, which again, we can find that some of our meetings are very agenda heavy. We have a lot of bullet points. And actually I found that coming up with a fewer number of topics, but and allowing the conversation, allowing room for people to give their opinions, for a debate to happen, maybe to disagree with some of the points being made and to explore that disagreement, has been really beneficial.
And that's another key role of the chair, is if where you have got an agenda and you sometimes have to play it a little bit by ear, because you try and set down times for each agenda item, but sometimes you'll find that a topic will come up that warrants more conversation to get the right outcome. So it's just that playing it as when you're in the room. So there's a little bit of intuition has to come into play as well. And sometimes it might mean that you have to roll over an agenda item to the next meeting, but sometimes that just makes it worthwhile rather than just trying to rush through stuff and not get anything out of it.
Yeah, I guess there's something there, isn't there, about when you're busy and you're going from meeting to meeting and you're aware that you've got these agenda items you want to get through, but it's worth just coming back to that thought and thinking, actually, we want to do this well, and if we do fewer points well, we'd rather do that than just fly past 20 agenda items and actually not achieve what we wanted to. Yeah. That makes more sense.
Yeah. And I've been in meetings as well, and I probably done this, to be honest, where you make a point and somebody comes up with a viewpoint that's not in line or disagrees with what you're saying. And it can be very easy to try and dismiss that or close it down. And again, what we've tried to do is stay curious to the other person's opinion. And I found I've had to learn to do this, and I have to remind myself to do it. Because especially if it's something you're quite invested in or a topic that you're passionate about, somebody offering a disagreement or a different viewpoint that doesn't quite chime with that can be quite hard to react to. But staying curious with it, trying to understand where they're coming from, not missing it, but bringing it in, considering it. It may still be that the decision is to go with the original proposal. It might be that there could be a tweak to the proposal or it could be a complete change of stance based on a difference of opinion. And that's where diversity of thought comes in through inclusion in meetings. But staying curious for me is it's one of those things I write down in my book, and I have to just give myself a little kick in the leg sometimes to remind myself to do it.
Yeah, and I mean, Jackie will talk a little bit about more the session we had this week on how we chair meetings at the bank, and we had somebody who was in. She's one of our non-executive directors. So she doesn't work at the bank, but one of her observations was the fact that we were quite polite. So it goes to that, like, don't shy away from challenging different points of view, like Jackie says, but always make sure you're doing it in a respectful way, so it doesn't distract from where you're trying to get to. So have challenge, but make sure you get the balance right with respect.
Yeah. And some of the research we've done on diversity and inclusion as well is around female versus male traits. And as a female, sometimes it's more about harmony in meetings rather than disagreement or conflict. And I definitely fall in this camp in that I have a preference I want to be nice and be liked, and I prefer it if I agree with somebody. And it's more effort for me to offer a disagreement or a viewpoint that may not land as well. But we've got to find ways of drawing this out, and how can we know we're making the right decisions if we're not hearing, differences of opinion? So it's something that I'm aware that I do. So I think it is about creating environments in your meetings where it is safe to offer a different environment, that we are curious, that we don't react and close people down, and that we almost draw out from them more as much as we can. And by bringing in diverse audiences into your meetings, diverse backgrounds, diverse experience will help that happen as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I have that same trait. My instinct is to have everyone get along, but actually if you're looking at a project or, you've assembled those people in that room for a reason, and you've asked them for their time and resource and thoughts. So actually, you want to try and make the best use of them in there. So if that means that you have some challenge and some disagreement in the room, that's actually a better use of time than everyone going, oh yeah, that's fine, okay, great, on to the next thing.
Well, otherwise you're back in groupthink, can't you? If everyone's got the same opinion, well, what's the point? You may as well have not had the meeting and just go steamroll ahead. Watch out for that.
And also, you might leave the meeting feeling, oh crikey, not everyone was happy when they left. Sometimes it takes a few more days of thought and people come round or they understand. And where I have been brave enough to offer a different opinion or disagree, people have recognised that afterwards and come up to me and thank me for my contribution, even if they didn't agree with it. But it's good. It makes it more fun. The conversation's more fun when you're hearing the differences of opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point.
And then shall I talk about a couple of things that we've recognised? So we had this session the other day. We talked about inclusive chairing, and we definitely talked about the planning, what you do up front. We definitely talked about some of the behaviours, as we've just talked about, that go on during the meeting. And then we talked about what happens after the meeting. So it's important to do follow-up actions. It is important that you follow up on those actions. Everybody has a responsibility there. But what I really liked that came out, and it didn't immediately spring to my mind actually, so it was a really nice, again, what a great thing when you get different people in a room, different opinions, and give you more things to think about afterwards. But two things that came up. One was around reflecting, doing your reflection. So it's particularly if you're a chair of a meeting, or if you've been responsible for presenting a particular topic, to do that reflection on what went well in the meeting, what didn't go so well, but particularly when you're trying to get that diversity of thought come out, and what you can learn from that. Then the other thing I really liked was a need to recognise contributions, which I thought was a great point. So follow-up conversations or follow-up emails with people, particularly if somebody's spoken that doesn't normally speak up, or you know that somebody was being quite brave, or you know that somebody was a bit concerned about what points they might make. What a great thing to do after the meeting, just to follow up, a quick email, even better if you do it face to face or over the phone, just to recognise that they did speak up, thank them for their contribution, and hopefully that will encourage them to do it more going forward as well.
Yeah, that's what it's all about, is it? Those more introverted people, just giving them the confidence that, yeah, I have got a voice, I have got something to say. People, and more importantly, the other issue that I found with some of the more introverted people that I've had meetings with is they don't think what they've got to say is worth listening to.
Yeah.
So it's just giving them that validation that yes, you've got a point, and yes, we're going to listen to what you've got to say.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that we did. I'm a big fan of introversion versus extroversion preferences. I've learned a lot from it. We've used it quite a lot in my area of the bank recently to explore dynamics in meetings, and some people didn't like it. They didn't like this giving people a badge of introversion or extroversion. And what they were saying was that we talk about introverts needing support or needing to be brought into rooms, but the extroverts were also saying that with the other dynamics at play around the most senior person dominating or the most knowledgeable technical person dominating, sometimes even as an extrovert I won't speak up in meetings. So it's about all of us and how we get the best of everybody, and just being careful that we don't label people afterwards. But we find we try different techniques, we explore what works, and what works well for one group won't necessarily work well for another group. But yeah, just be careful about labeling, but it is about how we get the best out of everybody.
And that's it. That's where you've got to be flexible. So sometimes I can be a little bit more relaxed in the way I'm sharing, because if I've read the room right, it can work. But other times you need that formal structure. And similarly, like you said, if I'm in a meeting, sometimes I quite like to just sit back and listen to what's going on. Oh, and that's the other thing is that sprung to mind is watch out for people who are leaping to get into the conversation, because what research shows is if you're wanting to make a contribution and you want to speak, you're not actually listening to what's going on.
Yeah.
So it's almost like take a little like count to 5 type thing, listen to what's being said, and then bring yourself back into the conversation, because like I say, you might miss what's been going on.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You can't, our brains aren't able to really properly listen and prepare what we're going to say at the same time. We're just not able to do those two things. Something that I've done before is when I can feel myself wanting to sort of butt in and say something, is to write it down and be like, with a star next to it or whatever, so that I know that I'll come back to it and make sure I've said it, but that just gets it out of my head, and then I can listen to what people are saying. And it's just a helpful little sort of way to stop it getting stuck in the front of my brain and preventing me from hearing people. Okay, so I understand that you've had a talk this week about chairing meetings. Do you want to talk a bit about sort of what that covered, what it was for?
Yeah, we've actually talked about quite a lot of it already. So the focus was more on inclusive chairing of meetings. So what the chair can do to create an environment for people to feel included and for diversity of thought. And rather than tell people what to do, we invited people. It's about 25 people who tend to chair meetings, and we encourage them to share what's worked for them, which could include observations of what other people do that works well, and to get into small groups to discuss that. And many of the points actually we've already made, Addison, around what you do before, what you do during, and what you do after have come out in this conversation already. A couple of things I would just mention as part of that. I always find when I have meetings, what I tend to do now is roundtable introductions at the beginning. So even if people know who because sometimes you say, well, everyone knows who they are. Sometimes people nod because they think they should, even if they're not quite sure who somebody is. So I tend to start many of my sessions off now, meetings or training sessions, doing very brief name and what team I come from. And where that's particularly helpful is it gives people a voice very early on. Because sometimes I go into meetings and it can be a long time before there's an opportunity to speak. And then it's harder to act psychologically to actually speak up and say something. If you give people the opportunity early, I've found it can create more of an inclusive culture straight away. The other thing I quite like as a technique for some meetings, it won't work necessarily for very formal meetings, is small group conversations during meetings. So it's especially if you've got like a big group session of 15, 16 people, it can be quite difficult with the way a conversation goes to feel, can I disrupt? Will it disrupt the chain of the conversation if I speak up? A technique you can use is just allowing 5 minutes for groups of 2 or 3 people just to have a quick chat about something and then to contribute to a conversation. So not necessarily for your formal meetings, not necessarily. It can work, I've seen it work. But again, it can often be easier for some people to participate in a small conversation and then feel braver and because it's sort of a committee view when it comes to speaking up. So yeah, a couple of things we tried there and I quite like.
That's something I've started doing up front when I go into a meeting. I'm London born and bred, so on buses and tubes, don't sit next to me, don't even look at me. But you've got to be the total opposite in the meeting. So if I go into a meeting now and I don't know, I will introduce myself and I'll sit next to them. Because that then breaks the ice, and you actually you've got a connection with somebody in the room to start off with. So that was difficult, like I say, being a Londoner, but I'm getting there.
Yeah, and it's so easy and so effective. Yeah. And I usually find the person on the receiving end tends to like it. There's the odd one or two done, but most people appreciate you doing that. So
I really like that idea because I was thinking while we were talking about how, like I said earlier on, meetings can replicate so many of the same structures that are in our organisation. So the hierarchy is the in-groups, the out-groups, who knows people, who doesn't. So doing something like that, sitting next to someone you don't know or don't work with very often, just helps stop that this group of people are all sitting together or this team are all sitting together. It can just help mix up the room a bit. I think something that's really come clearly out of this, and I've been thinking about recently anyway, is very rarely you'll be in an organisation where you're sort of trained to chair a meeting. It's sort of something that people kind of pick up as they go along or do what people have done before. And we don't necessarily think about it as a skill set, but it absolutely is. And I'm thinking about, the meetings I've chaired where I maybe haven't done a very good job of it and others where I have. I think thinking about being a chair as a really important role, like you were saying, Paul, about being like the conductor of the orchestra. And that similarly with conductors, you train to be a conductor. You're not just plonked in front of an orchestra and expected to get on with it and make a symphony happen. So it's thinking about partly your own development as a chair. What skills do you need to develop or get better at, ways you can learn from other people, but also as an organisation, how are you empowering your chairs and empowering people to lead those meetings well? Because I think with the right chair, you can have a really inclusive meeting that has everyone involved and gets where you need to be at the end of it. Whereas maybe left to their own devices or with not such good sort of steer coming from the chair, that wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, we've definitely invested in training courses on chairing. Definitely done that. And a technique we've also tried more for team meetings and less for the formal meetings is roving chair. So there's one thing going on a training course, there's another thing being a chair in a meeting. So to allow some practice around that, in many of our team meetings now, we have roving chairs. We take it in turns being the chair, and that would include being responsible for putting the agenda together, for talking to people about who's going to present, putting the right structure to the agenda, and then conducting, as in Paul's terms, conducting the meeting itself, and then following up afterwards as well. And that's been a really great initiative, and particularly for more junior members of staff, where chairing can often be the most senior person in the room. To give them that opportunity early on and build some confidence around that has been really effective.
Yeah, we've built on that a little bit in not the team I'm in now, but the team before, is we wouldn't rotate the chair every week. We'd do it in blocks of 4. So there's always like a more of a sense of ownership, and also it helps build your confidence, because if you're chairing sort of once every 6-7 weeks, you kind of lose your flow. So we found that having that sort of block of 3 or 4 helped to have that sense of ownership.
And you can really do your reflection
exactly,
afterwards,
and put it into action the next. And I just interrupted you. It's only the first time.
No, you built on what I said rather than interrupted. I like that. That was good.
I think that's a great idea. I really like that, and I think that it's quite an effective way, changing the chair, to prevent that sort of everyone just cedes control to the most senior person who chairs it, and no one really prepares for the meeting or thinks about it, and they just sort of turn up and sit down and then leave at the end, and they were just sort of keeping the chair warm for the hour or whatever this period of time was. So I really like that idea.
Well, I was going to say that sometimes if you do have senior people and they've got behaviours there where they've been used to chairing, they've been used to speaking up early on, or for their opinions to be the ones that lead the course of the meeting, we have a responsibility to help them as well. So maybe give them the feedback or encourage them to listen. I worked with somebody once who made an effort to be the last person to speak, and really had to work on pausing, not allowing their body language to speak for them. And not every meeting, but again, just playing with that, trying different techniques. But yeah, don't assume that everybody will just play a new role. Sometimes we need to help each other and give the occasional signal that somebody needs to stop talking so the next person can speak up, or encourage somebody else to come into the conversation. And I do think sometimes that does include, sometimes that speaking over people is a technique to move the conversation. So again, it's trying different things out, isn't it?
Yeah. And the classic has just happened to me. If I don't get what I want to say out straight away, it's gone forever, and it just has. So that moves the conversation on.
So we've covered kind of the empowering of chairs and seeing that as really a skill set that people can develop, and that everyone is in a different place on that sort of level. We've talked about the sort of interpersonal skills you need to chair a meeting and to be in a meeting. So it increasingly feels to me like if you're thinking about making your meetings inclusive, you want to, from every bit of it, you want to be thinking of it about how you're going to include everyone, play to people's strengths, and try different things, like you were saying, Jackie, kind of playing with different techniques or methods and just sort of seeing what works rather than sticking to the same old structure that you have done before. One thing that we've touched on, but I want to spend a little bit more time on, is men speaking over women and how to address that. So have either of you had experience of sort of actually challenging that in a meeting and how to do it?
Before we do that, there's something to say about playing to people's strengths. There's playing to people's strengths, there's also recognising people's weaknesses. And don't be afraid, because that being aware of both sides of things can kind of like bring them, I don't know, sort of bring it together a little bit. Sorry, just need to get that in before I forgot that bit.
Yeah. So
talking over people.
Yeah. So I think it's sometimes has become quite prominent in where we've had meetings where women have been in the minority. And again, some of the research suggests that because you might only have 1 or 2 women in a room with 8 or 9 men, that when a woman speaks, it's a different sound. So people are more you notice it a bit more, perhaps, which means that you might judge it a bit more as well. And recognising that you may feel different means that you may not want to speak up as well. So There's something about, I think, being aware of research, pieces of research, being curious about it. And as a female colleague, as a woman, I question myself as to whether I've done enough to speak up. I usually find a buddy in the room. So my boss, I sometimes, if we go into meetings together, he's male. I might make him aware of particular bits I'd like to speak up on. So if I haven't, he can help bring me into the conversation. Or just ask me if I have an opinion to share on it, and it's okay if I do. And again, be wary of the dynamics that might be at play. So if there is a lot of male voices going on, I think we talk about the role of a chair in inclusive meetings. In our session the other day, we also talked about the responsibility of everybody in the room. There's a responsibility on everybody to have an inclusive meeting. So don't just leave it to the chair. We could all sit there and see that somebody hasn't spoken for a while, ask them if they'd like to be brought in, not put them on the spot, but just you can even make contact to see if they might want to speak up.
And that's the thought I had earlier on. It was about we spend a lot of time in meetings. That's investing time, that's money. So if you're in a meeting, you're there to contribute, and your contributions need to be valid. So participate. I think that's really key.
So I think I always try to think for myself, what support might I need and what could I put in place? Now I've been around for a bit longer than some of my colleagues, and I've tried different things. I am quite open to new techniques, so I'm more confident in seeking that support. So then I keep an eye out for others in the room who might need that support, and I encourage my management peers to look after the colleagues in the room as well. So, and I think there's a lot can be said for just demonstrating some of these behaviours yourself, because others see what you're doing and hopefully they will pick up on it as well, and try the techniques for themselves.
It goes back to that orchestra conductor point, is where you, as a chair, where you can see it happen, it's doing it in a way that you're not shutting down someone who's talking in a way that's rude, or because you don't want them to then disengage, but it's just doing it in a way to bring the person who maybe wants their voice to be heard, just to bring them out. And you've got to be a bit brave and just call it out. I mean, if you were out with your friends and you were getting talked over the whole time, you would probably have something to say about it. So just use some of that confidence every now and then. If you can do it outside of work, bring it into the workplace.
I also think if I can't get into a conversation, I switch off a bit. So I might have had a really good point to make, but if there isn't a way of getting out, I switch off a bit and get a bit bored. And I think knowing what I'm like, that I'm not the same as everybody, but again, I just look to see how we can get the best conversation going, really. So looking after each other, I would say, keep an eye on everybody, and also be honest with yourselves as to whether you've got the right people in the room, I suppose. Have we invited the right group of people? Could we have different people next time that might give us a slightly different conversation? It might depend on what decisions have to be taken. Sometimes there is a hierarchy on decision making, but not in every meeting. So
I think that's a good point. And I think if you're someone who is aware that power dynamic is something that happens, that men speaking over women, or the other thing is where a woman will suggest something and then a man will say it later and he'll get the credit for coming up with the idea, is that as men in meetings, we have a responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen. So if a woman is getting spoken over, say, use your power in that meeting positively to say, look, Jan said XYZ earlier, can you build on that? Or you're making the same point that Sarah did 10 minutes ago. And it starts to build that. Partly it's you using your power positively, but it also then starts creating that environment in a meeting where those challenges can happen in a perfectly civil way. And then it helps everyone feel able to do it.
And it's anybody who's being not getting their point across, isn't it? So that's really important. The other techniques I've seen in some meeting rooms, we tried it at work about a year ago, was having things on the table that you could. So if you are an introvert or you're a bit of a twitcher, you had stuff that you could play with.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like helping you sort of channel your energies into something while you're doing the listening.
Yeah, we also tried cards, red card, green card. So if there was a conversation going on and you had a point to make, you would hold the green card up. Or I can't remember what the red card was. I don't think it sent it out. It might need to close them down a bit, But we tried that. That was quite fun.
That's really interesting.
Particularly the green one, which was around, I've got a point to make. But then you have a responsibility if somebody holds it up to bring them into the conversation. Because a couple of people said, well, I had a point, you did listen to my green card. But it was quite fun.
I'm always likely that people with colour blindness.
Oh, yes.
Well, yes, you could go for symbols rather than colours if you're worried.
But down.
I like that idea. So picking up on your point about having things on the table to fizzle with. So that builds into all kinds of inclusion, partly if you're just a bit of a fidget or if you're anxious, but also if you're on the autistic spectrum, having something to like a fidget toy essentially can be really helpful in helping you manage processing the information that's happening in that meeting. And I think it can help as well, just even, if I walked into a meeting room and there was a bunch of sort of fidget toys on the table and everyone's doing what they need to, that just helps me think, actually, this is a space where I can be myself or do what I need to be my best self in this meeting. It's not about us all sitting formally around a table.
Oh, and that's the other thing, is sometimes don't all sit around a table. If you've got like quite a short meeting that you need to have, just go and stand up somewhere and have a quick, because just by virtue of the fact you're standing up will mean that the whole sort of tempo of the meeting changes. So think about where you're meeting as much as anything else. I love it in the summer. I'll sometimes take a meeting outside because that in some ways can help relax individuals if you're sat out. So just think about the location of where you're having the meeting.
Yeah, I've done walking talks. Small group, but oh my gosh, the brainstorming, it flowed so much better because you were outside, you were in different people walking past, looking at different buildings, and walked between here and I think we went right up to St Paul's, walked around the gardens at St Paul's, and it was amazing, just the completely different thought patterns that went on. Yeah.
That's really useful. Okay, so we now have a little bit of time for Q&A. So those of you on the webinar, we've had some questions already, so we'll get to those. But if you have any questions that you want to ask, please type them into the chat box and we will get to them. So I'll just give you a minute or two to do that. Okay, so we'll start with the first question, which Isabella sent through to us, which again is a situation I'm sure a lot of us have been in. What if you don't have time to prepare an agenda before the meeting?
Yeah, well, ideally an agenda is better. We've just found full stop. Without an agenda, the risk is people, well, one, they can't prepare for the meeting, unless it's some sort of standing meeting, standard conversation you have, but it does risk that people aren't prepared, and there isn't a chance really to challenge the agenda either, or challenge what's going to be discussed. And some people are just better at off the hoof conversations. Again, I can blag my way through most conversations like I am now, to be honest. And I can do a lot of thinking on my feet. And I have colleagues that need time to consider. I had a very good friend of mine, and I used to have great ideas at work, and I'd go and roll my chair up next to them during the day and say, I've had this idea overnight, blah, 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 this is what I'm thinking about. And she would just push her chair away a little bit and say, do you want me to respond now? I do need a little bit of time to process that, to think it through. If you want me to come back to you, give me a bit of space. I was like, oh gosh, really? I'd have other colleagues where I could just bounce ideas off, but it just really made me think about the need to allow space for some people to do that thinking and preparation. So I suppose there will be occasions where it's got forgotten, there isn't time, we agree on agenda in the room. The risk is you're not working to some people's preferences, and the conversation may not be as well thought through ahead of speaking. So
Mm.
it may be that the decision that's made lacked some breadth of thinking around it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and whatever you do, don't blag it. Be upfront that you haven't had time to do an agenda and take a punt. I mean, and then ask for opinions around the room, because it may well be the best thing to do is postpone the meeting.
Yeah.
Because like as I said earlier on, if you've got 7 people sat in a meeting that's supposed to be there for an hour, that's a day's work gone down the drain. So be brave enough to say, let's postpone and we'll have it at X time. If you're not comfortable in doing the off the hoof, as Jackie mentioned.
Yeah.
And I guess thinking about, if you're in a situation where a crisis has occurred, you absolutely have to have a meeting right now.
Yeah, that's different, isn't it?
That's different.
Yeah.
But also, when you're in that room, explain that, give people the context of where you are and where you need to be at the end of the meeting. So then at least people have a bit of a chance to understand why they've been pulled together and what the context is before they can make decisions.
So I've been in situations, because the role I was in before was a chief operating officer, so you'd have incidents that happen. So you would go into a meeting without an agenda, but then you'd really clear up front about what the situation is, and therefore what you then need to do as a result of that. And that's hopefully you'll get people then to contribute to what we need to do, because they understand the situation of the meeting. I think that's what you get.
So it's probably something now about being clear on the purpose and the roles people are playing in the meeting. Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, so next question from Darren. How would you manage someone in a hierarchical organisation who dominates as they are the most senior person in many meetings?
Do we know about hierarchical
organisations? A little bit. My preference would be to have a conversation about it. The individual is probably aware that they are tending to speak. Not every is often a leader, and not every leader wants to be in that situation. But
because they're introverted leaders.
And some of them actually would prefer not to chair, and so they can more actively participate in conversations. But there can be a behaviour where it just is assumed that that's the role they're going to play. So we've had some strategies around having more effective meetings that have allowed us to put that challenge in place, perhaps. But I think it's about bringing it up in conversation and maybe just making an observation that they tend to speak. And is the nature of the meeting for them to brief people or cascade messages, or is it a discussion? And if it's a discussion and you want more people to participate, to be heard, and to shape and influence the outcomes of decisions, it might be that having a rotating chair, or so we talked to one of our leaders once, and they made a point of trying to be the last person to speak, so hearing from everybody else first.
So they sort of reversed the behaviour.
Because another thing that can happen when a leader speaks up first is you feel a need to almost go along with what they're saying, or it sets the direction of travel you're going in. So again, I think it was part of some of the leadership training we do, management training. It's just so it's not just about you and your thinking. It's about different techniques you have to draw on, so that you can listen to others first and observe what's going on.
Well, it's something that's certainly got a hell of a lot better since I've been, because we are more aware of these things, and we are more aware of these, and some of our senior managers have actually come out and said that they didn't realise they had these preferences, but now they've been told about them, they can act differently. So it is about doing them a favour and letting them know what they're getting not quite right, shall I say.
Absolutely.
And I think, again, clarifying responsibilities. So often a leader is responsible for the decision. So it might be when we've got something crunchy we've been discussing and we have to make a decision, it may fall on their shoulders to make the ultimate decision. But it should be having taken in the views in the room, or explaining why somebody's viewpoint or preference or their suggestion, why we can't go down that route and why we're going to go with the decision we've taken. And again, so we have to work with hierarchy, but I think just explaining sometimes why we're taking a certain direction is helpful.
Okay, so we've had a comment from Laura, and Laura says, I'm a little uncomfortable with introversion being confused with a lack of confidence. I'm an introvert who's very confident in my opinions, but I need time to prepare my arguments before speaking. So an agenda in advance, for example, is helpful, but inviting any comments by email after the meeting would also be helpful. I really like that idea. You're totally right, Laura, they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of having that space after a meeting to add comment too, because also, regardless of, you might not have been able to be there, or there might have been other things going on, or you're just a bit more of a reflective thinker, that then after the meeting you've actually got some things to add on. So I think making a space for that to be involved is a great idea.
Yeah, and also recognising that I'm quite extrovert, but sometimes I do like chance to reflect. So even in this session now, it's great hearing Jackie talk, and then as she's talking, I'm thinking about what I want to say, rather than another time I might be the one that jumps in first. So it is about just recognising what your preferences are as an individual.
Yeah, I work with some amazing introverted people with every introverted preference, and are definitely very confident in what they're doing. And I work with some great extroverted people who lack confidence. So just because they're comfortable perhaps in speaking up or speaking before they've thought it through doesn't mean to say they're confident in what they're saying. So absolutely right, Laura, good point.
So we've got a question from Ellie. Do you have any advice for helping manage meetings for those with hearing impairments, or setting up offices or meeting rooms in a way that supports their needs? So I'll touch on that one first. I find I have hearing processing issues sometimes, especially when I'm on the phone. I'm much better in the room, but I can't always obviously be in the room for a meeting. I have to dial in, or that's the only way I can kind of access it. So something that I've looked into is using headphones instead of using the phone, because I can get slightly better sound quality. Or if it's a short meeting where you're having quite a quick discussion, then it being on the phone is manageable. But if it's something longer and a bit more in depth, then I need to be in the room often. I find that it's partly about thinking about all the different levels of communication styles or needs that people might have. So are you in a room like we were today with some nice drilling going on in the background at the start of it? Is there anything you can do about that? Is it a case of asking people where they'd best like to sit, if it works better for them sitting maybe nearer the screen so they can see the slides or so they can hear things, and just being open, I guess, to using what you've got to make it as open for everybody, if that makes sense.
And it's always useful if you do need to make adjustments in a meeting, that what we're finding work is that people are getting better at telling us what those adjustments might be, because that goes a hell of a long way. Somebody who has maybe got hearing issues, they can tell me what the problem is because I can't second guess it. So it's being open, and then also just making sure that we've got something called lots of firms do around reasonable adjustments. Just making sure that you use the equipment that you've got that can support everyone in the room.
There's two things I would add to that from my experience is if you can set the room up so that everybody's sat at the table and the person with the hearing difficulty can see everybody, is helpful. You could do it so that, depending on what the impairment is, but you could do it so that if somebody wanted to ask a question, they raised their hand, so it's very evident who was about to speak. And then the other thing I would say is managing small talk in the room. So I've got some colleagues that with hearing disabilities, and what I've learned from them is, I think it's difficult for all of us sometimes when there's small talk in the room and where's the conversation going, or somebody starts to have a little tit-for-tat at one end of the room while somebody's presenting. But when you've got a hearing disability, that's even worse. So I think it's been making people aware that we'll have one person speaks at a time, and then you really do conduct the room so that we don't have this small talk going on.
That's great. That's some really, really good answers. So we've got time for one last question. If you notice somebody is repeatedly talking over people in meetings, would you talk to them after the meeting or during?
I don't think there's a hard and fast rule to that. To that question, you've got to play it by ear. Sometimes it'd be absolutely appropriate to do it in the meeting using some of the things we talked about earlier on. Similarly, it might be better to leave it afterwards, just to have that conversation.
My preference would be to say in the meeting.
Yeah, that'd be my preference. But sometimes,
but the dynamics, sometimes, or the politics of the meeting might be that that's not appropriate. But I think if it was you and I, Paul, in a meeting, I might say, well, we've heard a lot from Paul. Actually, I'd really like to hear from some other people in the room, to try and make it really obvious that I'm giving him a cue to stop talking and allow room for others. And you might do that a couple of times. And I have tried that in a room. And you do get some persistent offenders that do they've got, and particularly if people are really passionate about a topic.
Yes.
You know, I don't want to.
Thank you everyone for joining our webinar. We've still got tomorrow. We've got webinars happening and events happening all through the week. So do check out the Inclusive Employers Twitter feed to see what we're up to. Thanks again to McDonald's and to all of you for supporting Inclusive Employers to make National Inclusion Week the best ever. If you're not already a member with us and you'd like to know more, have a look at our website to find out what we do. Thanks everyone. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.